All right. So my name is Michael Colosimo. I am the current president of the Arizona Mushroom Society, and I'm here administering the webinar, the NAMA webinar tonight. So tonight we have Boletes and Boletales of Arizona by Christoper May. Like I said, I'm the current president of the Arizona Mushroom Society and also a close volunteer. I work closely with NAMA for volunteering. And let's go through some of these slides here. So we have some upcoming events, 2024 forays. We have the NAMA Mexico, August 3rd through the 9th, NAMAzona 2024, which is going to be a very special event here in Arizona, August 22nd through the 25th in Strawberry, Arizona. And also the Pacific Northwest NAMA Camp, October 31st through to November 3rd, also known as NAMAween to certain select few people there. Sir Trent will appreciate that one. Upcoming virtual events, we have How to Start and Grow a Mushroom Club, April 16th with Luke Smithson, Tryptamine Fungi of North America and New Discoveries in the Taxonomy of Psilocybin Mushrooms is April 23rd with Alan Rockefeller, and Virtual Book Club, Mycelium Wasoni by Brian Blommerth, April 25th, hosted by Eva Gordon. And some more, we have Using Phylogenomics to Resolve the Evolutionary Radiation of Boletaceae, April 29th by Brian Denchinger, Cultivation, Identification, and Quality Control of Functional Mushroom Products, May 8th by Jeff Chilton, and Practical Foraging, Where and How to Find Burn Morels, that's May 12th by Trent and Kristen. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started into our presentation of Boletes and Boletales of Arizona by Christoper May. So a quick introduction to Chris. I've known Chris for many years now. He actually was one of the founding presidents of the Arizona Mushroom Society. He's also worked closely with NAMA. He's recognized by the NAMA Toxicology Committee for medical and veterinary consultations. So Chris continues to be involved with forays and meetings of the AMS and has lectured to many audiences about mushroom toxicity and the fungi of Arizona. And before we go ahead and get started, a few housekeeping things here. So if you have a question, you can drop that into the chat. This is going to be a fairly long presentation, so we'll save most of those questions till the end unless it's fairly urgent. And everybody can see that inside the chat, the host and panelists and the guests. So I will go ahead and pass this off to Chris, and you can go ahead and get started.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Let me see if I can get my...
I wonder if was I not sharing that entire time my screen?
Correct.
Okay,
I couldn't see
all right.
anything but you.
Okay, let's go back and just so everybody can see this from the recording. Okay. That's my fault there. Just these for the, let's see, the events, everybody has those dates. So we'll go back here. So the 2024 forays, just so everybody can see that on the recording. Upcoming virtual events. And then this second page of the virtual events. All right, I'll go ahead and stop the share so you can start sharing.
Okay. Here goes. That's not what I want. Hang on a second. All of a sudden it switched over. 1 second. Share screen. Desktop 2. Share. And we will now play. And yeah, thank you for that introduction. And I see some old friends near and far in the attendees. And I see some heavy hitters in the world of mycology too. So it's not without a little trepidation that I, come on here and try to do a little presentation on this topic. I just would say this is basically show and tell, mostly taken from collections of boletes and their relatives that I've made, and that others, some of whom are in the audience, have made and posted on INAT. and I am not a mycologist, and I'm certainly not a boletologist, but I've been at this for a few years, and I've got some kind of cool pictures to show you. I just want to make sure that everybody understands that this is not meant to be relied upon for purposes of identification or consumption. This is just informational only. We are not responsible for you using this information to poison yourself. So when in doubt, throw it out, as always. Just to run through the habitat and terrain that we have for in our state for people who aren't familiar with it. A lot of people from elsewhere are surprised to discover that we have not just deserts. Obviously we have enormous deserts, hot deserts. We also have high mountains that go up to almost 13,000 feet. And those are, you know, that going along with that differences in elevation, you have great differences in rainfall, as you can see on the bottom left side of this picture. Places where we get, you know, more rainfall than say Portland or Seattle in a year in precipitation, snow and rain. And those differences in rainfall lead to differences in vegetation. And if you remember Merriam's life zones from your high school biology, we have, you know, we start in the lower desert with the creosote bushes and the saguaro cactuses. We go on up through the oak woodland, the chaparral, the pinon juniper or PJ forest, up through oak and pine woodlands, ponderosa pine forest, and then we get into the sort of the mixed conifer fir forest, and then at the very top, the very highest altitudes, we've got the Hudsonian forest that's dominated by spruce. So this is what it looks like in the low desert, and that's what everybody thinks of when they think of Arizona. The riparian zones, we have at all elevations, and they're very special places that have their own, you know, great diversity and panoply of fungi and other organisms. This is up in the PJ forest around Sedona. Then we've got the oak woodlands. Manzanita down in southern Arizona has its own fantastic diversity. And then we get a little higher. We're in the ponderosa pine and gamble oak. We start to get into the aspen, and we get a little higher, and now we're up in the fir, the mixed conifer, and up into the spruce above 9,000 feet. And up there in the White Mountains and some of these other very high elevation places, you can almost think you're in Colorado or someplace like that. Those transitions are fairly gradual in most of the state. Down in Southeast Arizona, we have more abrupt transition. We have these mountains that are really prominent relative to the surrounding terrain, Mount Graham, Mount Lemmon, and so forth. They're called the Sky Islands, and they are really unique zones full of all kinds of spectacular biodiversity and full of rare species that are not found elsewhere or seldom found elsewhere. And this is a picture of Mount Graham, you know, standing down in the desert at its foot at maybe 2,000 feet. The top of it is nearly 11,000 feet. You can see the snow up there. And when you get up to the top of it, again, you might say it feels like you're in Colorado, and certainly not in the desert. And then just looking at how we are forested here and where we sit, we're kind of at a crossroads here. We've got some contiguity with the Rocky Mountains. We've got some contiguity with the Sierra Nevada and the other coastal ranges. And we are certainly close to the Sierra Madre Mountains of northern Mexico. And now, what it looks like now is not what it looked like in the last glacial maximum. If you go back 25,000 years, this is a very, this is a crude approximation, and it's missing a few things, but it'll give you the general gist of it. We had glaciers coming down practically to Ohio, and then we had the spruce forest south of that, and not necessarily a dense forest, but kind of like the sparse forestation of the taiga in Russia and so forth. And then we had a mixed conifer forest over much of the sort of southern part of the state, or southern part of the US. And if you look at Arizona and New Mexico, you can see that, you know, most of the desert didn't exist. It was a cool and very wet, very moist climate, and heavily forested. Half or more of the state was thought to be, you know, either spruce fir or entirely spruce, sort of subalpine forest. There was even a couple of little glaciers on the very highest peaks. And that's obviously changed a lot. You can see where all that red came in. That's the ponderosa pine, which those are adapted for the dry land. They don't much like the moisture that we had back in the Ice Age. So our forestation has been completely replaced, but we still do have, as everything sort of climbed up the mountains fleeing the warmer weather, we have these special sky islands that are like lifeboats or islands of mountains in a desert sea. And there is still a lot of continuity, or I should say a lot of similarity to the boletes of the eastern US, and you'll see it again and again as we go through this. So just really quickly, what is a bolete? Again, we're doing this at a relatively basic level. So I want to explain a few words so that some of the newcomers can understand what we're talking about. They are characterized by pores on the underside of the cap, the hymeneal surface. That's kind of the classic feature that determines them. They have what's called a pileate stipitate morphology with a stem and cap, like a sort of a classic mushroom, and typically growing out of the ground or terrestrial rather than on wood or any other substrate. And they are typically growing symbiotically with the tree roots. Now, that said, there are exceptions to these rules, and we'll talk about some of them, especially at the end of the chat. And they're really interesting and important fungi. They are some of the biggest, most common, most charismatic of all our macrofungi, and they have a great deal of culinary and cultural and economic value. Just briefly, what is not a bolete? Well, poroid mushrooms are really quite common, and there's at least 8 other orders, at least 7 other orders of the agaricomycetes, other than the boletales, that evolved poroid morphology, having these little holes or pores. And I'll just show a few of them here. This one's closer related to the russulas than it is to the boletes, and this one is closer related to the hawkwings. Used to be considered a bolete. The Boletopsis name tells us that it was moved out of the Boletus genus at some point. And here's a Polyporales. Here's Coltricia, Gloeophyllum. This is related to your brittle maizegill. Fistulina hepatica, that's your beefsteak, and beefsteak mushroom, and even one of these that's kind of closely related to the wood ears. So this is something that it's an efficient way of increasing the sort of surface to volume ratio and getting a lot of mushroom spores produced in a small space. They can be, you know, a lot of them are stemmed like a bolete, but they have other morphologies. One of the things that really characterizes the boletes is that you can usually peel those pores away from the cap in a layer, but that's not typically the case with the others. So this is what we would call convergent evolution. You know, if there's a good idea, nature will find a way to do it again and again and again, and pores are a good idea for spore production. Okay, then just quickly running through you know, how we characterize them, how we draw their family tree. On the left, you can sort of see the relationships of the boletes, and specifically our Boletus rubriceps, On the right, just for comparison, you can see what it would look like for you and me, going from most specific to most general, all the way up to the eukaryote multicellular organisms. And then to make it a little more complicated, now we'll just concentrate on the boletes and the many relatives that they have. If you go back to 1753 with Linnaeus, when he first circumscribed the genus Boletus, he basically took everything that had pores on it and he put it in that genus. And so everything that we call polyporous now was in there, and then some of these other things that are not related to Boletus closely at all. But eventually we got microscopy, we got some biochemistry going. We figured out that polypores and some of the other pored mushrooms are not really boletes at all. And we went a little further and we found that there are close relatives of the boletes in the genus Philoporus that actually have gills instead of pores, and that there's also a bunch of other relatives, near relatives of the boletes that don't look like boletes at all. So if we've got time, we'll run through some of those. Now, so we've got at least 100 edible species in the Boletales. It's probably a lot more than that. There are a few that are toxic. We have about 70 different species in this order, and maybe half of them are considered edible, not necessarily good, and many are yet to be described. Within the, if we go down to the family of Boletacea, we've got about 22 genuses and 50 species altogether in Arizona, most of which are typical boletes, but we do have a couple of species of Philoporus, and this is where our best edible boletes are. Then if we narrow it down further to genus Boletus, there's about 200 of them around the world. Some come and go. A lot of species have been moved to other genera. And then there's some species that get split, like Boletus rubriceps used to be considered part of Boletus edulis. They stay in Boletus, but now they're a new species. There's about 8 species that still hang on to the name of Boletus in Arizona, maybe a few more, but some of those are going to leave that genus and end up somewhere else. And then we go one group even smaller. Now we're in the Boletus edulis group, and this is what's considered the true porcini, the porcini clade, typically Europe and North America for Boletus edulis, but there are relatives, all around the world, primarily in the Northern Hemisphere. For these Boletus edulis group, the most characteristic feature is that they've got white reticulation or netting on the stem. And so, white, very good tasting flesh, typically not staining at all. Small white pores with a stuffed appearance when they're young. And we have 2 of this group, at least 2, but 2 for sure in Arizona. And those are the famous Red and White King Boletes. And that's where we'll start actually doing our show and tell on the Boletacea. Here's a young Boletus rubriceps with very small pores that you practically can't see into because there's little chylocystidia at the pore mouths there blocking them. That's what we mean by stuffed. So the Red King Bolete, Boletus rubriceps, comes from the Latin words for red head or red cap. For a long time, it was thought to be a color variant of Boletus edulis, or it was mistaken for the reddish pinewood bolete of Europe, the Boletus panophilus. David Aurora and Jonathan Frank wrote a paper in 2014 that made the case for calling it a different species, and we've been doing that ever since. We've got several common names for it, but really in Arizona, I guess ever since the Aurora and Frank paper, we've just been calling them rubies. I think one of our club members, maybe Beth Bilodeau, started calling them rubies, and everybody kind of followed suit. And that's what most people will use to refer to these. So it's got a brick red cap, feels a bit greasy when it's very fresh. They're very firm when young, and that's where we get the name Steinpilz in German. That means stone mushroom, and it refers to just how heavy and solid and firm they are. They get a little softer as they age, but when you have little buttons like this, what the French would call a bouchon or a cork, it looks like a champagne cork, they can be almost as firm as a potato. The stem is quite stout, kind of off-white to buff to kind of tan. Tends to be kind of club-shaped at the base and distinctly reticulated. You can see the reticulations on this picture. And maybe I got even more. Yeah, there, especially at the top of the stipe here, you can see the white reticulations that are really a distinguishing feature of this mushroom and its choice edible relatives in the porcini clade. Has a very strong liking for spruce trees, and in particularly young spruce. And you can find them sometimes next to even one tiny little seedling or sapling of spruce. And then as they age, they can be enormously large. They get very soft and they become bug hotels. Even in old age, they can sometimes be useful for, drying them, letting the bugs fall out into the bottom of your dehydrator, and then grind them into porcini powder or make broth or something out of them. So don't turn up your nose at them until they're really, really more bugs than mushroom. It's typical to find these in the edge habitat where the forest meets the meadow along especially the north-facing tree lines. And it's important to note that they will sometimes be in clumps of grass. They can be 50 feet or more away from the forest edge. They basically can be as far away from the trees as the tree is tall. And this is particularly the case in spruce country, like this is, up typically above 9,000 feet in our part of the world. And did anybody see that? That's showing one of these clumps of grass that's hiding a Boletus rubriceps. Sometimes you can find more of them out in the grass than you can in the forest. It has some marker species. We've got the fly agaric, Amanita muscaria, that most people have seen, red with white dots. We have the porcini spy. It's called Clitopolis prunulus. And also, if you see the hawkwing around the Sarcodon imbricatus, you are, probably going to find porcini that day. And there it is again, see? Okay, so there it is. There's one porcino, one Boletus rubriceps with its friends, the Clitopolis prunulus. And let's see here. I wanted to get my, hang on just a second here. Okay. I wanted to get my laser pointer working, and there it is. Okay, so yeah, now we can do that. Okay, let's move on. Here's a picture showing our friend the fly agaric, Amanita muscaria, in the corner. I couldn't find any really good pictures showing them side by side. I know I have one, but I couldn't find it. So if any of you has a good picture like that and wants to send it to me, I'll make it part of this presentation. It does sometimes, it can be found with ponderosa pines. And again, it seems to prefer the younger ones. We most often find it in pretty crowded thickets or groves of the younger pine tree saplings. They're a little bit different in morphology typically, but I'm not sure they're a different species. It's probably just environmental differences. So we consider them all to be rubies. They're all equally tasty, but you can see in this case, you've got the pine needles and pine cones, and it's not under spruce. There's probably not a spruce within 5 miles of this particular photo. Okay, where were we? So the distribution of them goes from the Four Corners states primarily, and in particular Colorado and Arizona, but all over the Four Corners, up into Wyoming, maybe even Montana, the Black Hills of South Dakota over here, and down into Mexico. And it is quite popular in Mexico City. The mountains around Mexico City have a fair number of these, and you can find them in the markets down there. Are you guys seeing my laser pointer okay? Hopefully. All right. They typically come along right after the monsoons begin, about 2 weeks after the first heavy rainfall, typically late July, coming to a peak in early to mid-August, and they're pretty much run their course by about mid-September, but I've found them in every month from June through October, when the conditions are favorable, when we have early monsoon rains or we have a warm, wet fall. You can certainly see them. Let's see. Okay, on to our next great choice edible bolete, and that's Boletus barrowsii, or Barrows Bolete, White King Bolete, White Porcini. I've heard them called queen boletes by some people up in Colorado. I have not heard that terminology down here, and there is a actual queen bolete along the West Coast. So we just call it a Barrows Bolete or a White King. The name honors Chuck Barrows, who was a amateur mycologist, very dedicated citizen scientist who sent a lot of specimens of these to Drs. Smith and Tears, who are great mycologists of the last century, and they defined it as a new species in I believe 1976. Before that, it was just thought to be a white variant of Boletus edulis. And if this picture looks familiar here, this is from Lisa Goodwin, one of our longtime members, and it was nearly perfect example of this species, so we made it into our logo, and it's been there ever since. It's very similar in most respects to Boletus rubriceps. The cap tends to be a little more suede-like and dry and not quite so greasy, and then it's got a grayish white color typically, often with a tint of tan like you see here. The reticulation on the stem, it's always there, but it tends not to be quite as conspicuous as it is on the Red King. And sometimes it grows in really amazing clusters like this one here. These were all in one grouping. I don't know if I would call it actually cesspitous, but it came out as one big clump. Okay, so where do we find it? Well, here in the Four Corners states, we find it in under ponderosa pine. It fruits a little earlier than Boletus rubriceps often. The season's a little shorter. It doesn't tolerate the cooler weather or drier weather as much. We do also find it along the West Coast up to as far north as Vancouver Island, maybe even Alaska, but there it grows under live oaks. And there's some question as to whether it's the same species or something similar, but actually different. Okay, let's see. Now we do have a couple of these similar members of the Boletus edulis group that grow down in the region of the Sky Islands in southeast Arizona. and maybe elsewhere in the state, rarely. You can see that these are reticulated, just like all the other porcini here at the top of the stem, those white reticulations. They tend to be a little smaller, a little less robust stem. And as you can see by the leaf litter around here, they grow under oaks rather than pines as a rule. We have two separate ones that have been sequenced that have the nickname of Arizona White 1 and White 2. And they look pretty similar to each other. But the feature of this White 1, I believe, is the one that really shows this extensive reticulation. It really stands proud from the stem, and so it's a little bit different from your typical Barrows Bolete right in here. And the other thing is these will sometimes stain a kind of a lilac color on the cap, and this really shows it to good advantage. And that's not a feature of the regular Barrows Bolete. So studies on these are ongoing. John Frank and Aurora and a few other well-known mycologists are, collecting these, and at some point they'll get written up and they'll get a new name. They should stay in the genus Boletus along with all the other porcinis in the Boletus edulis clade. This is the second species. Can almost have a cinnamon colored cap and very diminutive, very small stature, not nearly as big. Okay, one of our other mushrooms that is still in Boletus is this one called Holoxanthus. It's named because it's yellow all over, and we don't really find it anywhere else. All the parts of this mushroom are bright yellow. They will stain blue, except down at the stem base where the stains tend to be sort of a winey maroon color, whereas the pores, the cap, and the upper stem will stain blue. It has reticulation that's typically yellow, although it can get a reddish tint. And according to John Frank, it's probably going to end up in a relatively new genus of boletes called Alessioporus. Enjoy this Boletus while it's still in Boletus. It's edible. It's said to be kind of nutty, maybe a little bit sour, but it's not one that you'll go out and find frequently enough to make a meal. They're not super common. We find them in the oak forests, southern Arizona, New Mexico, Sierra Madre of northern Mexico. And if I back up there, let's see. And here again, you can see a lot of blue staining, but then this wine colored staining at the base. And they get a little darker on the cap, a little less viscid. They even start to crack a little bit. All right, this is the live oak territory where we find them. They're not really up in the conifer forest at all. And that is the distribution of them. They are pretty much confined to the Southwest here, and particularly Arizona. They do get into New Mexico and certainly into Mexico, but that's the ones that have been logged on iNaturalist. Okay, now we get into some of these weird ones with the red to orange pores, blue staining, yellow stems, red stems. There's a lot of them, and they look a lot alike. And John Frank tried to explain them to me, and I'm still a little bit confused. They're named for the Latin luridus, or pale yellow. And there's a bunch of mushrooms that have names that contain, that are based on luridus, and they look a lot alike. So as we go through here, you may soon be as confused as I am, but there are a few distinguishing features that you can see. This one being Boletus subluridalis, and it has a yellow stipe with some red tints, but no reticulation, kind of orangey pores, and velvety orange to reddish brown cap. and stains dark blue when you cut it or bruise it. I think all parts of the mushroom are distinctly staining. It's also an oak affiliate. It primarily is found back east, and this may not actually be true Boletus subluridalis, but it sequences out close enough. It's possible that it's edible with lengthy cooking, but we don't recommend that. It will probably end up in the genus Neoboletus, but it's not there yet. It still goes by the name of Boletus subluridalis. And this is the distribution. Remember I said we were going to see mushrooms again and again where you would have a distribution out in the eastern part of the country, and then a few little lonely relicts here in the high mountain refugia of the Sky Islands. And actually, it's not just the Sky Islands. We find a lot of these mushrooms up in the main part of the forested belt that goes from the northwest down to the middle of the eastern part of the state. And so all of that is areas where after the Ice Age, a few of these species were able to survive by climbing in elevation as the glaciers and retreated and the temperatures warmed. This one is Boletus. It's not subvolutipes, but it looks very similar. And to my eye, it looks almost exactly the same as the one I just showed you. The red-mouthed bolete, red or maroon pores, they fade to orange. You can see this younger one here has sort of reddish pores, whereas this older one, they're going more to orange. The cap may get a little cracked as it gets older. The stem is mostly yellow, but it does show some little tiny flakes, and that's there's a word for it called furfuraceous. It's dark blue staining, just like the other one. This one, I think this is a distinguishing feature, is that blue stain ends up fading to a white color after some time in the air. This one is considered toxic, a gastrointestinal irritant. It is another one that is supposed to be transferred to Neoboletus one of these days when the science has been completed. And you look how dark and dark blue, almost navy blue, that it stains. I'm afraid I don't have any that show it going to white, but maybe that's what's happening in here. Some of these little slices. I haven't run across this one myself, so I'm depending on a lot of folks like Christian Schwartz and John Frank to save pictures that I'm hopefully remembered to give them all credit for in my little talk here. This one, again, it's primarily an eastern species, or at least the true subvolutipes is. It also exists in the southern Rocky Mountains, and there's a few stragglers along the west coast and up in Canada. Now this one here is it's probably an unnamed bolete. It's been mistaken for the xericomoids, the xericomus and xericomelis, many times because it has a kind of a suede-like tan cap that can crack as it ages. It's got these kind of large, irregular, bright yellow pores that stain blue. The stem has, it's yellow at the apex. It has a lot of reddish dots going up and down, and it's got a lot of variable morphology, but we've collected it several times in Arizona, and it always comes out on the DNA sequencing as being very close to Boletus bruneo-tomentosus. It seems unlikely that it will stay in Boletus, but that is yet to be seen. It's probably not toxic, but we don't know that for sure. And here's what it looks like when it's sliced open. Gets a bit of reddish streaking, red pinkish change. Let's see. This is an interesting one. Now we're out of Boletus and we're into a genus called Boletales. And in all of Boleteles, there's only been 2 that have ever been collected in Arizona. I've never seen it. John Frank, I think, collected this one. And he at first thought it was a pulchra boletus or some other Boleteles called pseudochrysantoroides. But when they ran the DNA sequence, it came out as a nearly perfect match for a Boleteles that grows down in Belize in Central America. So this is a real oddball. You probably won't see it if you come here unless you really diligently look for it like John Frank does every summer. They can be a little more reddish and still have the same DNA sequence. And this is the actual collection of Boleteles belizensis. So you can see a little bit of the family resemblance. I didn't show the distribution for Boleteles belizensis because this is the only one that exists on INAT. Even in Belize, they don't have any that have been actually posted on iNaturalist or Mushroom Observer, so we can see the distribution of them. But the genus Boleteles in general is mostly Eastern and Mexican. Now we get into some that are a little more distinctive and a little easier to identify. This one's an Boletus russellii, Russell's bolete, jagged stem bolete. I've never heard it called that. It's always Russell's bolete. And obviously the distinguishing feature is these really, really coarsely ridged stipe here of reddish brown color. And then another feature that's supposed to be quite distinctive is that when you bruise the pores, they become brighter yellow. I have not seen that, but I'm told that's what happens. So that's kind of unusual. It's said to be edible. I don't think people go out looking for it the same way they do for the porcini. It's mostly a mushroom from the eastern North America, Mexico, and Asia. One of the curiosities of this one is that if you magnify the spores, it has these longitudinal ridges or striations that are very similar to the actual corrugations of the stem. So just a coincidence, obviously. There's no greater meaning to it, but it's kind of cute to show. And this is the distribution here. Again, Eastern US, Mexico, and a little southeast corner of Arizona in the Sky Islands. So kind of a cool, very interesting just because of its shape and, morphology. There are 2 species of Boletus that are novel that we have discovered recently. They're very similar to Boletus auroporus, or the sour gold-pored bolete, but they seem to sequence out to something slightly different. They're relatives, but they're not the same species. Just like the auroporus, they have a sour taste, very bright yellow pores. That's how they got their name, auroporus, meaning golden pores, or bright yellow pores. And again, primarily found in the east and southeast, and a handful down in Mexico, and really not much anywhere else in the west. And this just shows how truly diminutive they actually are. They're not very large mushrooms at all. Now we are with this one. This one is called the graceful bolete. It used to be Tylopolis gracilis, as the pore surface becomes kind of pinkish as it ages. And so it was in Tylopolis for a while, but it's now in the genus Boletus, and it's not necessarily the true Boletus gracilis that is, what everybody calls the graceful bolete, but it's very similar, and it's a close relative, despite not matching exactly. The true one is an Eastern North America, Mexico, and Asian species. It turns kind of pink when you cut it, and it's often got these longitudinal grooves that you can see here, although I'm told that that's not a distinguishing characteristic. Sometimes the stem can be a little more smooth. And that kind of shows the pinkish color of the maturing pore surface that had it in the genus Tylopolis for a while. This sort of cracks or ridges on the cap, I believe, is fairly characteristic. And unfortunately, I don't have a picture of it turning pink, but this is what it looks like. This one is even smaller than the one I showed you before. This really is a tiny little bolete, and if you're looking for something the size of a porcino, you will overlook it completely. You can see the oak leaves around showing the habitat that it likes. And yes, it's a theme here. Again, this is one of the boletes that is part of the eastern US, funga and Mexico, and then a little bit in Arizona. This is a really curious one here. This is a Buchwaldo Boletus. It's very similar to Buchwaldo Boletus hemicrisis. I'm not sure how to say that, but again, it sequences out a little bit different, but we know that it's got to be a close relative, not only from the morphology, but from the fact that it was growing out of a dead pine tree up on Kendrick Peak outside Flagstaff. So this is, unlike the other mushrooms, remember I mentioned that most of the boletes are terrestrial ectomycorrhizal species that grow symbiotically with the tree roots. Well, this actually decays the dead wood, or in other words, it's saprotrophic. It's growing on the wood. And lignicolous is, I guess, the fancy way to say it. It rots the wood. There's some question as to whether or not it's truly parasitic, but it definitely is one that you find on dead or dying pine trees and not growing in the ground. It does stain blue, and there's a couple more pictures. There it stains blue when you cut it. And this one is primarily down in the southeast, and then here in Arizona. So kind of a curiosity. One little outlier down in Mexico too, near Mexico City. So not one that you would expect to find here, but there we go. Moving on to Boletus pulchriceps. That comes from Latin, I believe, for the beautiful capped butter bolete. That light yellow bare stem, very, very small light yellow pores that are stuffed with Chylocystidea when the mushroom is very young. The beautiful pink color of the cap, as it gets a little older or in different climatic conditions, it may be more tan than pink, but it's usually a lovely pastel pink color. And then underneath you'll see a bright yellow mycelial mat. Now there's a bunch of butter boletes that grow elsewhere in the country. The West Coast has quite a number of them. And some of them are really choice edibles. This one, I've never eaten it myself. It is edible, but it's not, supposedly not quite as delicious as you might think from a name like butter bolete. Let's see here. So there just shows you how very small and how tightly stuffed those pores are when the mushroom is really young. And that shows you the yellow mycelial mat if you dig a little underneath them. And these are primarily in central to southern Arizona and New Mexico. There have been a few found up along the Front Range in Colorado. Now, this one, for a while, people were calling it a butter bolete also, Batira boletus, but I think it is still, if I'm not mistaken, has been moved back to Pseudosporus frostii, or it's called Frost's bolete or the apple bolete, due to that candy apple red color, especially the cap. This is another one that has really coarse ridges, or I guess you could call it reticulation, but it's hardly netting. It's really deep pits and ridges. The stem doesn't stain. The pore surface, however, certainly does. The pore surface is red and it will stain dark blue or purple if it's bruised, and it exudes these yellowish droplets of liquid. That's a process called guttation, and that's I think where the exudosporous name comes from, if I'm not mistaken. It is edible. It has a kind of a slightly sour citrus flavor. I don't think, from what I hear, it's a great edible. It's another one I haven't tried, but it's it's edible if you want to give it a whirl. It's another one of the many oak affiliates that we have, so not necessarily up high in the fir and spruce. There it is at a little more mature level. And here's what it looks like when it's cut. A little tinge of blue staining, not much. And let's see. Now, if we move on to the genus Boletus, kalos being the Greek word for pretty or beautiful. These are the bitter blue staining boletes, which are not to be confused with the bitter boletes of the genus Tylopolis, which we'll get to in a minute or two. This one has yellow pores that stain distinctly blue, often pretty quickly. Stem is yellow up here at the apex and red below. May or may not be reticulated. It seems to be variable, at least around here. It has they all have a disgustingly bitter taste. We have several very similar varieties. All of them are likely to be novel species. They're close to other species that I'll mention as we get there. Let's see. This one is very similar to Boletus frustosus or Boletus conifericola, which I think is a West Coast species. But it's probably not either one of those. It's probably our own. It has a kind of a cracking cap that looks almost xericomoid. It does have some reticulation on the stem, which in some respects resembles others in the genus that are reticulated. The cut flesh stains kind of a medium blue, or the pores too will bruise. And then you can see down here in the bottom right corner, you can see how they kind of go brown. So I think if I, hang on just a second, if I back up a little bit, on this one, you can see here's a fresh stain that's blue, and then here's some old stains that have started to go brown. And then same thing happens when you cut the flesh. Very quick sort of cornflower blue stain. And then after 15-20 minutes or so, that goes back to a brown color, tan color. The Boletus frustosus is a West Coast species, maybe getting into the Northern Rockies, and then Arizona, and really nowhere else. And as I say, this is not necessarily Boletus frustosus. It's a relative, but probably something else according to the DNA. This is Boletus inedulus, which means inedible, as you might guess. Has a fairly pale cap. The red and yellow stem I mentioned that are characteristic of this species does not show reticulation. The pores are yellow and stained blue, like you can see here, and the flesh is kind of whitish. It's inedible. It's another one that's just revoltingly bitter. And if it's the true Boletus inedulus, I think we have sequenced it out, and it is truly this species, but I'm not 100% sure of it. But again, it exists here in the corner of Arizona, and then mostly back east, and in a little bit in Mexico. Then this one's Boletus rubriceps, the western bitter bolete. Stem is variably red and yellow. Rubriceps means red foot or red stem. So I think this is maybe uncharacteristically yellow. A lot of the other collections are a bit more red. The pores again are yellow. and stained blue. It's a little bit darker than that real pale cap on the edulus, but doesn't normally crack. There, that shows you a really bright red ring at the apex of the stem there. And then this one, if it is truly Boletus rubriceps, it's a Rocky Mountain and West Coast species with a few down in Mexico as well. Moving on to Chalciporus. This comes from the Greek words for copper and pore. This is another interesting one because its metabolism, the way it makes its living, is by being parasitic on wood as a rule, not mycorrhizal, although there are some in the genus that are thought to be mycorrhizal. They're small, they have the copper colored pores, and they tend to get some use for dyeing textiles. So I think the type species and the most common one, if I'm not mistaken, is Chalciporus piperatus, or the pepper bolete, which has a really distinctly spicy taste. It's got this brownish orange kind of cap, smooth and shiny when it's dry, gets kind of sticky when it's wet, and kind of looks the same all over. It has yellow basal mycelium, nothing, the stipes otherwise bare. And then you have, and then it will bruise a little darker brown if you bruise the pores. There is one that's identical in morphology, really, but it's not spicy. That's Piperatoides. And let's see, these are still Piperatus that I'm showing here. And then I think I've got some Piperatoides here somewhere. So that's the distribution of Piperatus. It's fairly generalized in the forested areas of North America and Central America. And then this is Piperatoides, which is basically identical morphology, but not as spicy. So a little less common, or at least less commonly collected, but has more or less the same distribution. There is one that has a brighter reddish appearance to most of its parts, especially the pores. This is a Chalciporus rubinellus. It is not spicy. The mycelial mat is white instead of yellow. And this one tends to be found as a mycorrhizal partner of spruce, I believe. And again, a Eastern North America species that just happens to have an outlier here in Arizona. We have Lexinum, at least 3. Well, we have at least 5 of these in Arizona, I believe, and possibly more. Probably none of them are the same species as the others that exist elsewhere. It's really a mess, the taxonomy of these. They're very difficult to distinguish. The DNA sequences, the ITS sequence that gets used for assessing the DNA is really supposed to be unhelpful with this species, and so they are hard to distinguish. Anyway, they have sort of classic boletoid anatomy with pores underneath, and these convex, typically orange or red or brown caps. There can be other colors, and white pores, dry, sort of fibrous caps. They're not greasy like the boletes. They can get very large. They can get easily as big as a dinner plate, if not bigger. And they're fairly common in forests all over the world. The stems have these little specks, slightly elevated dots called scabers, that distinguishes them from the reticulation of the porcini. The flesh is white, but it can stain various colors when you cut it. And it gets some culinary interest, especially Eastern Europe. They're very, very fond of this one. But it's not considered to be the equal of the porcini for the table. We have we have, Terry Clements tells me that it's making a mistake to call it an aspen bolete. In my experience, these orange capped ones seem to be in the aspens, but she is not so sure. So it looks like the aspen bolete, Lexinum insigne. It is not the same species according to our best genetic phylogenetic information. But it looks very similar. It has that orange cap. The scabers are kind of a brownish color, dark brown. The flesh is typically sort of a purplish gray color when you cut it. Now, the aspen boletes in the northern Rockies have caused a lot of cases of gastrointestinal maladies in recent years. We have not really seen that down here in Arizona. We've been keeping track. A lot of people eat these down here, and one of our members, Bill Warner, has been keeping track, asking people who eat them if they've ever had any GI problems with it. And he's found one person out of nearly 100 that he's asked that has ever had anything untoward from eating these. And so maybe that's another clue that they're not the same as the true aspen bolete. But if you go and look online, you can find these logged, their DNA sequences will be under this TAC 231 temporary label that I believe Terry Clements assigned them. And this is what they look like. They in the aspen groves, but maybe they're not. Maybe they're more promiscuous or cosmopolitan than that. Then we have another one that has a more reddish capped appearance, reddish, or even sort of a reddish brown or chestnut brown cap. And although this one we think can fade to a similar orange color in the sun, so that it can look identical to the aspen bolete. This one is different genetically, and Terry, our star citizen scientist, has assigned it to this temporary label of TAC 64. It seems to be in pine forests. Again, she warns me that you can't assume that it's a pine or conifer obligate symbiote, that it may be more common there, but she thinks it's not that simple. We've been using Lexinum vulpinum as kind of a placeholder, but it's not a precise match to any known species. You'll sometimes see it online. People will put it as Lexinum montanum or Lexinum ponderosum. I see a Q&A popped up there. Oh, okay. Michelle says, I've eaten those plenty of times and with others. No one had a problem. Okay, that's great to know. Okay. And thank you, Michelle. You borrowed a lot of your pictures. So, okay, moving on. And for some reason, it's not moving. There we go. It tends to have this blue-green stain at the base. This is the more red-capped version. And then it's more purplish staining as you get up higher in the stem and cap. And the scabers are dark brown or even jet black. And this is kind of the brown color of it sometimes that you sometimes see. And we have one, you can see in the background, you can see manzanita wood. This is similar to the West Coast Lexinum manzanitae, a close relative, but probably not the same. Scabers have a kind of a brownish, light brown or almost orangish brown color that we don't really see with any of our other Lexinum. Blue-green stain when cut, and it seems to be particularly conspicuous where the pore layer meets the cap. There it is right there. On that stripe there. Then this is one that we found in low-lying bog up on the Mogollon rim, kind of a gray brown cap, kind of a tall, skinny one with brown scabers. I don't believe it's the same one that Terry has sequenced. As soon as we find another one, I had this one set aside and I don't know where it got to. And I apologize, Terry, if you're watching, but if I come across it when I move my house, I'll make sure to I'll be moving in a few months and I'll be sure to send you the specimen. Now, there's another genus, Lexinellum, that looks very similar. And the only difference that I can see from Lexinum, morphologically, is it has a little bit more of a yellowish tint and a lighter colored cap than a lot of our Lexinums. The pores look a little more yellowish too. The scabers are brown, but otherwise it's very similar morphology to the Lexinum. This is a novel species. It's similar to Lexinellum viscosum, or possibly it's in Garcilexinum, which is another relatively new genus that has been split off, I guess, from Lexinum. And the only place that this DNA sequence has been found is in the Huachuca Mountains in Arizona. And John Frank has collected it a few times. It has a reddish purple stain when you cut it, and not real big. There's a Hemilexinum species, again, split off from Lexinum, I guess, for reasons that make sense to the boletologists. It is believed to be another novel species, kind of a light brown tannish cap. The stipe is yellow with reddish dots, and they're very small. You can barely call them a scaber. They're just little tiny dots, and a little bit of cracking to the cap, and kind of yellowish to whitish flesh that doesn't seem to stain much. And as far as we know, it's only in Arizona, so I didn't put a map up for it. Now, this is a really pretty mushroom that people from back east will probably be familiar with. This is Haria or Haria chromopes. It's a species complex, we believe. We think that our species, or maybe our two species of this mushroom, are novel and not yet described, but we've just been using Haria chromopes as a placeholder. The common name is the yellowfoot bolete or the chrome-footed bolete. It's got a nice pinkish cap, not quite as pastel pink as the Boletus pulchriceps, but it is a distinctly pink most of the time when you find it, although it can be kind of tan colored too, especially as it ages. Pore surface is white, although as it gets a little older, it tends to turn pinkish, and the spores are kind of pinkish. And so for a while it was in Tylopolis. It was Tylopolis chromopes. It also has pink scabers that very much resemble a Lexinum morphologically, except for the pink color. So for a while it was categorized in the genus Lexinum. Ours have kind of a bulging middle frequently. Let's see, let's go back. Kind of I think that's called a ventricose contour. Not always though. And then the really distinctive feature, other than the pink cap and scabers, is this bright yellow, chrome yellow stem base with yellow mycelium that sometimes the little fibrils of it hang off the base of the stem when you remove it. We find them under pine, we find them under oak, we find them under manzanita, and we think there's two different species. Let's see, where were we? There's that yellowfoot. It's really quite yellow when you cut into the very bottom of the stem. And there's the little yellow mycelial fibrils. And there's an old version with a really, really rich, bright yellow stem base and pink pores right there. And let's see, it is edible. It has a kind of a citrusy taste. I've eaten it many times. It's not bad at all with things like chicken and fish. And when we look at the distribution, it is by far the most common back east. It gets down into Mexico, where it is eaten and sold in the markets, or at least a similar species, maybe not the very same, but in that complex. And then we have it here, and it doesn't really appear anywhere else west of Texas and the Great Plains. This is a relatively new genus, Lanmaoa, named after a Chinese naturalist, and most of the species that have ended up in this genus are Chinese, but there is a handful in North America. This particular specimen that was placed in that species, or in that genus, looks similar to one called Lanmaoa pseudosensibilis, but it's almost certainly novel, just like so many of our others. You can see some blue staining, kind of a reddish stipe, reddish brown cap, and blue staining when you cut it. Looks like it cracks when it gets old. I've never seen it, and it's unlikely that any of you will, unless you go looking for it. Now we're in Boletus, which is another kind of messy genus. We have at least one sequenced species, this one here being Boletus vermiculosoides. The cap is a little lighter and light brown, yellow brown, maybe with a tint of red when it's young. And then these orange pores, they start out orange, but they get a rather kind of dark brownish orange as they get older. They turn blue when bruised and then back to brown. And then you can see the brown staining on the stem. And when we cut the stem, it's kind of curious how the top of it is sky blue and then the bottom of it stains red. So a distinctive pattern of staining. Seems to be mycorrhizal, I think, with oaks, and cracking at the top. Let's see, there's the orange pores that first stain blue like this one down here, and then as they get older they go back to brown like that up there. And there they are, staining blue on the top, red on the bottom. Once again, if this is truly Boletus vermiculosoides, it's another primarily eastern species, one little straggler down by Veracruz or Puebla in Mexico, and then multiple times that we've collected it here in Arizona. A couple of other novel Boletus. This is the one that John Frank calls the chameleon. It presents with different shapes and sizes and cap colors, but when he sequences them out, they come out to be the same. I'm not going to go into that. If you're interested, I'm sure he can inform you about it. He'll be writing it up in a paper one of these days, I'm sure. And then distinctly staining, quickly blue staining. This is the other one, I believe has only been found in the Chiricahua Mountains. Similar orange pores, blue staining, maybe a bit more yellow to the stem. It's showed some features of Boletus erythropus or subvolutipes, but this DNA sequences don't show a close match to either of those species. So it's something new, and it will be in John Frank's next paper probably. Here's a Pulchroboletus rubocitrinus. This one has a reddish cap. It can be almost blood red, almost like that Frost's bolete, or brick red. Then the pores are, as they mature, they get kind of angular. They stain this indigo blue when they're bruised. The stem is bare, yellow at the apex, red going down, white basal mycelium, and then some blue staining again at the top when it's cut. Let's see. Frank has collected, he thinks there's 4 different species in this genus. So I've called it Boletus rubriceps, but it really should just be genus Boletus at this point, I think. This gives you a nice view of those kind of irregular angular pores there. And more examples. Anyway, the true Boletus rubriceps is a mushroom of mostly the southeastern, Gulf Coast area, gets into Mexico, gets into Arizona, and there are a few that have apparently been found in California. This one's called Red Boletes. It's the ornate stemmed boletes, characterized by the wine-colored stains on the base. It's reticulated pretty dramatically, but the same color as the stem, or a little darker. And it's not the white reticulation of the porcini. Let's see, I see a couple more questions. Let's see if there's anything. Was asking Bauerangia bicolor. To my knowledge, that one has never been collected in Arizona, and I'm not surprised that there's some overlap there. That seems to be a theme with these sort of red pored, blue staining boletes. There sure are a lot of them, and I don't have any idea about the distinguishing the land moa. I'm sorry, I've never seen it. I just collected it when I went looking for Arizona boletes and thought I would do the show and tell for you. So John Frank is the guy to ask, or some of the other boletologists who know this one. So we have at least 3 of them. One of them, I believe, has been sequenced out to Boletus vinacepes, which has those wine-colored stains I mentioned. There's another one that's similar. Let's see if I move it along. Come on. That's the vinacepes. And then, again, mostly Eastern, but here we are in Arizona with the same one. This one is Boletus CF griseus, similar to griseus, the gray bolete, but it's not quite the same. You can see really dark reticulation on this one, and this one grows with oaks in southern Arizona. And then there's another one called Cerulea marginatus. That's a new one that I think Frank or maybe Christian Schwartz sequenced. This is the live oak sort of medium elevation forests where we find these. And then this is the Cerulea marginatus, the other species in this genus. Okay. And I can't really say too much about it. Now, moving on to rubra boletus. These are the boletes that are thought to be the most dangerously toxic. Are now, I think, all in rubra boletus. The famous Satan's bolete, Boletus satanus, which I think is a European species, actually, that we don't have here, or maybe Eastern US. But we do have the mountain Satan's bolete, Rubra boletus hematinus, and that's the only one that we have proven with DNA sequencing in this genus from Arizona. We think it's symbiotic with Douglas fir, grows in the Rocky Mountain states and Sierra Nevada, where we find the Douglas fir. The pores are yellow when it's young, and the cap is kind of tan. And the stem is yellow with a pink tinge. And, you could look at that and call it a Cala boletus, or, there's several other things that it could be mistaken for at first glance. As it ages, though, it's very distinctly blue staining. As it ages, those pores get a kind of a pinkish orange color. The cap gets a little bit lighter, as you can see here. It's still a light tan, but it is lightening up. You can see distinct blue staining where the stem has been handled. There is reticulation that kind of tends to match the color of the stem. And again, blue staining when you cut it. And then as it really gets older, those pores get quite red. They can even get maroon. And we we liken it to red velvet cake. It's really a maroon color, and I think, yeah, there I go. That's a good example of it. And then you can see these reddish reticulations at the top of the stem, and now the cap has gotten really light, like the Boletus satanus. And so this one is fully mature, and you know, this one's easy to look at and say I shouldn't eat that. But yeah, just remember the red velvet cake under the pore mouths there, the coloration of the hymeneal surface. And it's interesting, if you, that's only at the pore mouths. If you cut into the tubes of the hymenium there, the tubes are still yellow just beneath the surface. Okay, so we've got a few other unsequenced collections that haven't gone through DNA sequencing that may be novel. How are we doing for time here? We're getting close. There's that red velvet cake. And this is a mushroom of the mountain west, again, where the Douglas fir grows, probably. And we find it in a lot of places in the high mountains of Arizona. This is Strobelomyces, the old man of the woods. We have a handful of them here. I've seen it 2 or 3 times. It's not super common. Ours looks like Strobelomyces strobelaceus. It's distinguished by these almost woolly, prominent black scales on the cap. And the stem tends to be dark and shaggy as well. The pores are dark. And when you cut it, you get slowly red staining flesh, and then it turns black. People eat it. I'm told it's rather mediocre. I've never tried it. Kind of a muddy taste, supposedly, but if that's your thing, go for it. And again, primarily Mexico and Eastern US, but it has an outpost in Arizona. Now we're in Suillelis, these typically orange pored boletes. We have one that we have sequenced here called Suillelis amygdalinus. Oh, I see a couple more questions. Let me stop and see if it's yeah. Well, the first one was, they mentioned that the red bug holes were mitelle on the Landmauer versus Bauerangia. So that, I did not know that, so that's good. And now another attendee says, tips on distinguishing Rubra Boletus from the Cala Boletus rubripes. I think when it's younger, that's a challenge. When it's older and you've got that red velvet cake, it's easy. And maybe one of the, maybe we can address that again at the end and talk about the differences by someone who is more capable than I of really making those fine distinctions. So this one grows on the West Coast in Arizona. There's a few in the East. They can look a little bit like Rubra Boletus, but we don't see that red velvet cake maroon color. The pores tend to stay kind of orange or reddish orange at worst. And then it has a, you know, the nickname liver bolete comes from this appearance of the cap. So that's pretty different from the pale cap of the Rubra Boletus. It can be a little lighter when it's younger, but as it matures, that's what it'll look like. Little or no reticulation on the stipe, and the staining tends to be really dark, midnight blue, dark purple, or just, you know, downright black. It gets some dark staining on the cap as well, dark staining on the stem. I don't know if this was handled or if it just matures that way. And, you know, is it bruising or is it natural? I'm not certain, but look how dark that staining is there. Okay, and then a little fine reticulation, but not very much of it. And here it is, predominantly West Coast, but found throughout the forested areas of Arizona. There's at least one other, and maybe I think John Frank thinks there's at least 2 other novel species in this genus in Arizona, and a little bit lighter colored, you know, both as the base colors and a lighter blue stain that's not quite so blackish. but seemingly in the same genus. Now we're in Tylopolis, the bitter boletes, and don't confuse them with the bitter blue staining boletes of Calopus. Most of them are revoltingly bitter the same way as Calopus, but there are a few that are good, including one that we have here, and I'll show it to you in a minute. The distinguishing feature for Tylopolis is the pinkish spores and pore surface, one that we have is Tylopolis. It's, again, we're not certain that it's Plumbo violaceus. It may be a close relative rather than the real thing. Terry Clements thinks it's novel. It's very distinctive by that purplish color. The dry, almost suede-like cap, it's either purple or lilac colored altogether, or it's kind of a purplish brown. The stem is dark purple when it's younger. It becomes, again, more purplish brown as it grows. There's some white basal mycelium. The spores, or the pores, can bruise a cinnamon brown color. The flesh is white and does not stain, and it is disgustingly bitter, but it's a very pretty mushroom, and it's always kind of cool to see it. And it is, again, predominantly Eastern US, a little bit in Canada, a little bit in Mexico, and then its little refugia in the mountains of southern Arizona. This one is Tylopolis rubriceps. Terry, I believe, has sequenced this and decided that it is the same as the real Tylopolis rubriceps. It has a really suede-like cap. Can be purplish tinge when it's young, but it's really reddish brown, fading to tan as it gets mature. Kind of a tan stem, bruises olive brown, and the pore surface is off-white to pink, turning pinkish brown as it gets old. Spore print pink, like all the Tylopolis, or most of them. Again, it's extremely bitter, not edible, and its range is, there you can see the pores starting to turn pink. Range is Eastern North America, Mexico, and the Sky Islands. Well, actually more than just the Sky Islands. It gets up into the Mogollon Rim country. And then we have this one called Tylopolis baticeps, or the beveled cap bolete. And this one, the distinguishing feature, I think I have a picture of it. Here it is right here. That beveled edge on the cap is characteristic of this one. But it's a much lighter tan. There can be a little bit of reddish brown tint to it, but not necessarily. The pores are off-white when young, get pinker as they get older, as you might expect, and they stain brown, like this stain here, brownish pink spore print. It is not bitter, and some people say this one is a very good edible. So if you see one with this beveled edge and it's this color, you might have found something worth keeping. Just eat half of it. Save the other half for DNA sequencing for the boletologists, okay? All right, let's see. I see another Q&A here. Let's take a look here. Tylopolis tastes bitter if sampled raw in the field on the tip of the tongue. Yes, I believe that's always the case. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. Okay. Long skinny stem. And yet again, Eastern US, Mexico, and Southern Arizona. Okay. This one is, I put it here with genus Xericomus. It has not yet been moved to Xericomus. It's still called Boletus oregonensis. I probably should have left it in Boletus until it actually made the move, but it's clearly got the suede-like cap of Xericomus. It probably will be Xericomus as soon as someone writes the paper. It has the rather large angular pores that stain blue-green, and they have a kind of a radial distribution. They'll line up along the radii of the cap. The stipe is smooth with some red fibrils, yellow basal mycelium. I think you can see it's kind of light yellow here. Terry has sequenced 5 of these, and they come very close to one from Europe called Xerocomus ferrugineus, or the rusty bolete. So it's probably, you know, maybe ours is somewhere halfway in between Xerocomus or Boletus organensis and Xerocomus ferrugineus. Maybe it's novel, I don't know. But it's one of the suede boletes. There you can see the irregularity of the pores. And if it is Boletus organensis, this is the distribution of where it has been flagged on iNaturalist. I think it's, well, it's certain that it was found in Oregon, so I don't know why the holotype isn't logged there, but it isn't. Then we get into Xerocamelus and the cracked cap boletes, and they have this blocky cracking that's called areolate, cracks like dried mud, and then identifying them to species can be a real challenge, and you have to decide, you know, the stem coloration, the color of the cracks on the cap, how fast does it blue, and you know, sometimes microscopy is required. So I'm going to go through them pretty quick. We have a couple that have been sequenced and probably more that are novel. We have found Amylosporus, where if you put Melzer's reagent on the spores, you get a bluish tint like you see here. We have done Diffractus, which shows more blue. It shows slower bluing than the Amylosporus, and it has these reddish color in the cracks on the cap. And then again, probably some novel ones as well. Alessioporus is a relatively new genus from 2014. I think it was created to separate out some Xerocomus that didn't belong there. And as I mentioned, that Boletus holoxanthus that we saw early in the lecture is going to end up in this genus, supposedly. It has kind of a yellow-brown cap that bruises blue, bright yellow pores that stain blue. The stem bruises blue and then fades to brown. It has yellow reticulation that will darken if it's handled. The cut flesh stains blue, except it can be red at the base. Supposedly it has a nasty taste, so it's not a good edible. There's that reddish tint at the base that I think is one of the distinguishing features here. And there's the blue stain on the pores. So I've never seen it. It seems to have been collected at several sites, not just in the Sky Islands, and then the rest of the range is back east. Hortiboletus rubellus, hortus being the Latin word for garden. It tends to grow in gardens and parks and places like that maybe have been disturbed. Cherry red cap when it's young, often a kind of a yellow band at the margin. These tend not to be very big. And it has these really irregular large pores that stain blue. The flesh will stain blue. And it looks like the stem will maybe stain a little bit blue as well. I've only seen this one once myself. Said to be edible, but tastes like soap and people don't really eat it. Very irregular pores, look at that. And then a blue stain. I don't recall it staining especially fast when I cut one open, but it does show some staining slowly. And it's, you know, it gets to the West Coast over here. But it's much more Eastern US and to some extent Mexico. Okay, Xanthocomium. I've never seen this. There's been one collection by John Frank, and the feature that is most distinctive here is it throws off this enormous yellow-brown spore print. Thinks it's a Gymnopolis or something with this heavy spore print. But if you're interested in it, John Frank can tell you about it. One more of the many that mostly appear on the East Coast. Now we're in Philoporus. These are the gill boletes. We have several species, the most common being Philoporus arenicola, by far the most common. And it has these bright yellow gills, next, kind of an olive or brown cap. You get some reddish brown markings on the stem. I've never tasted it, but it's said to be a pretty good edible. And the other thing that it sometimes gets used for is for textile dyeing. And here's a little more mature collection. And this grows in the conifer forest, you know, our mixed conifers. And they're not rare. We find them usually every summer. And it's the Western Gilled Bolete, and that's what INAT confirms. The map shows them primarily on the coast, but also throughout the Rockies and down into Mexico. Okay, there's a couple of other species that are not particularly interesting. I'll skip over them, and they tend to be more eastern. This one's kind of curious. This is Philoporus alborufus that John Frank sequenced, and look at those nasty pores. Really remarkable. Kind of intermediate between pores and gills. He doesn't know if this was a representative specimen or not, but that's what it sequenced out to. Let me see what the new question is here. What causes the blue stain so common in boletes? Well, that's there's several chemical reactions that take place in blue staining mushrooms. I'm not an expert in the biochemistry of that, but when they're exposed to oxygen, these compounds that exist in the cells of the mushroom just rapidly turn blue. And it varies too. It's not just one substance. There are various ones that cause it depending on the species. Okay, let's see here. Oh yeah, this one only has one other collection on INAT in all of North and Central America, and that's down in Costa Rica. I think it may be a South American species. Okay, now elsewhere in the order Boletales. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you the two that are typical boletoid anatomy, the two genera Suillus and Gyroporus, which look like boletes, but are not in the Boletacea family, but they are in the Boletales. And then we're going to just rip through about 15 or 20 species of things that are also relatives of the boletes, but look nothing like them. So let's move on. Here we go. We've got boletoid mushrooms that actually have the pores on the cap, and then the stout, typically the stout stem. Then we have species that have gills. We have gasteroid species that kind of have a gleba that degenerates in place, and that's how it spreads its spores. We have the underground, they're not truffles, they're false truffles, but they're similar to truffles, the same sort of ecology and lifestyle. And then we have actually some crust fungi, believe it or not, resupinate fungi that are close, reasonably close relatives of the boletes, which must have been a shock when they figured that out. So Suillus comes from the Latin word for pig or swine. Supposedly they were only good for feeding the pigs, according to the Romans. They're actually better than that. They have a good flavor. They tend to be kind of slimy and mushy. So some care is necessary as to how you prepare them, but a lot of people look down on them, but I don't. They have a nice taste. They tend to be symbiotic with conifer trees, particularly our pines and Douglas firs. Most of the species, but not all of them, have a really sticky, slimy cap with pine needles and other debris stuck to them. We have Suillus caibabensis. This is our most common, very similar to the Suillus granulatus with those little glandular dots on the stem, light colored cap, a very sticky, slimy cap. And we find it typically, there you can see all the stuff that sticks to it. We find it typically with ponderosa pine in the Southern Rockies. And that's the distribution there. Suillus wasachicus is practically indistinguishable, although DNA sequencing is very different. The biggest difference seems to be a more orange pore surface, reportedly. I've never identified it separately from the Chibabensis. Suillus occidentalis is another sticky, slimy, slippery jack, but it has a bare stem with few or no glandular dots. And the distribution is pretty much the same, Southern Rockies. And there are some people who think it's just a variant with fewer glandular dots. And it's not really a different species. I don't think that's the general agreement, though. Suillus americanus is the chicken fat mushroom. You can see these more irregular pores with sort of a radial orientation, brownish bruising, and kind of a nasty looking cap with brownish stains, radially oriented fibrils. It doesn't have that uniform tan or pinkish yellow tint of the others that I just showed you. There you can see those radially arranged pores again. It grows under 5-needle pines. So in Arizona, that means limber pine or southwestern white pine. And most of them are back east, but it's fairly cosmopolitan, and you find it under 5-needle pines in the west as well. Suillus luteus is the sort of true slippery jack, and worldwide distribution. It's rare here, but we do find it with white pine. This veil that becomes a fragile sort of transient ring, but covers the pores when they're young, is kind of the distinguishing feature. That one is found in a lot of places around the world, including the Southern Hemisphere, which isn't true of a lot of boletes. Okay, then there's this one that's blue staining. It has a kind of almost a woolly cap, yellow pores that have some radial arrangement. They stain blue when bruised, and has a lot of glandular dots on the stipe. And again, these are the 2- and 3-needle pines, especially the ponderosa pine, where you find these. And there's the blue stain when you cut it. It's mostly a Western species, but it seems to get back east and down into Mexico as well. This is Suillus lakei, the Western painted Suillus, or matte jack. It's got this sort of fibrous tufts or scales on the cap, kind of angular pores. It can have a ring or a partial veil and ring, but it tends not to hang around and quickly disintegrates. This is one, in my experience, one of the better Suillus if you're going to eat them. It's the Western painted Suillus. There's been a few identified back east. I think they're mistaking it for the Eastern version, the Suillus. I think it's Spraguei or Pictus or something. Spraguei, I'm pretty sure, is what they're misidentifying back east. Okay, Fusco tomentosus has this really fuzzy brown cap. You get little pinkish orange droplets on the pores. I don't know if they show up well here. And kind of a swollen base. If I back it up, that swollen base is kind of distinctive, and it comes under 3-needle pine, which means ponderosa in the west, along the west coast and in Arizona, and a bit in Mexico where they have some other 3-needle pines. Okay, now we're going to just start. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. This is a Suillus, or very closely related to Suillus, false truffle called Truncocolumella and what really distinguishes these are these yellow stripes when you cut it open. Those are the vestigial stem, the columella, said to taste like licorice. It's a Western U.S. species. Here's Gyroporus, the cornflower bolete. We've had one collection of these on Mount Graham. Bill Warner and I were up there and collected it. And it has these white pores staining promptly blue. If anybody collects this, it is a good edible. In fact, it's an excellent edible, but please at least save half of it for the for the scientists, okay? We need more collections of this one. It stains blue pretty promptly. I think I have a movie here. When you cut it or when you handle the stem or the pores, you get these prompt blue stains. And when you cut it open, you see this multi-chambered stem stuffed with this sort of soft, pithy stuff that looks kind of gross. But you can eat it. It actually tastes okay. There's Bill. A lot of you know Bill, the bug guy. Great guy, good friend of mine. And that's up on Mount Graham by the Columbine campground. Please look for this one and please save it for science. This is the normal distribution of it, almost entirely back east. One little outlier in the Calgary area of Canada. Here's what it looks like when you cut it. And very, very brisk. Not the fastest I ever saw, but still pretty brisk blue staining. And there you can see that multi-chambered stem. Okay. Let's see. This is its cousin, Gyroporus, something like Castaneus. We're not sure if it's the true chestnut bolete. It's probably not. We've sequenced at least one of these that is not identical, but it is in the same group, according to Terry. White pores that get a little yellow when it ages, and has a darker color, you know, the tan cap and brownish stem. It can actually get almost a chocolatey brown. I think I have, yeah, like that one there, as it gets older on the stem and cap. And okay, we've got the Gomphidiaceae. These are related to the boletes. These are gilled with those really decurrent gills. This one's Croagomphus. They're parasites on other fungi, especially Suillus. This one is Gomphidius, same family, but a different genus. That yellow base is characteristic. It has a slimy, you can eat these, and Chad Hyatt has cooked them for us. It has this really slimy membrane that you want to peel off before you eat it. Has a vestigial ring, and then this distinct yellow stem base. Let's see here. This one's Gomphidius glutinosus, kind of a brownish cap, maybe a little purple tinge, yellow. Doesn't grow in clusters. It's the most widespread. And then you have Gomphidius subroseus. This has the reddish cap, more distinct, and it grows in clusters. So those are the two features that distinguish it. And it's a parasite on Suillus lakei, the western painted Suillus that I showed you. There's the Suillus lakei right there. Then this is Smith's slime spike, or Smith's Gomphidius, and it does not have that yellow stem base. The stem turns black when you handle it, does not grow in clusters, and it doesn't have that purplish or pinkish tint. And then we have the Croagomphus vinicolor, or pine spike, fairly decurrent gills, sort of darker colors, smooth cap that is not so slimy, edible but mediocre. Hygrophilopsis aurantiaca, one of several false chanterelles. It's saprotrophic, probably growing on rotten buried wood. Whoops, let's start that up again, sorry. Its main claim to fame is that it looks like a chanterelle, but it's not. It forks uniformly on those gills, but the gills are not interconnected. Whereas if I show you a true chanterelle, hang on a sec, let me get my laser pointer back. Right in here, you can see these interconnections called anastomoses between the ridges, the pseudogills. They're not really true gills in the chanterelle like they are in the false chanterelle. Okay, Paxillus. Obscuriporus is our version of the roll rim pax of Europe, which would be Paxillus involutus. These are very tasty, they say, but we strongly discourage it because the European species has been responsible for autoimmune hemolytic anemia. That brown bruising of the gills and that tightly enrolled cap are the distinguishing features. So one of the gilled relatives of the boletes there, There it is, kind of crimped gills often. These are two kinds of tapenellas that we have. This one looks a little bit like the Paxillus, but has a really, really dark stem and grows on wood, conifer tree stumps in particular. And then this one, the main thing on this one, the oyster roll rim or the fan Paxillus, Tapenella panuoides, we don't want anybody mistaking it for oyster mushrooms or anything like that. It's got the same sort of crimped gills I showed you back there. It tastes good, but it's a gastrointestinal irritant. So, and then we have several kinds of rhizopogon, false truffles. Mike Dector makes potato chips out of these that are pretty tasty. And it's probably not worth dwelling on all of them, but there's several kinds here. And then we have the pigskin puffballs of scleroderma. Again, we have at least 4 of them that have been sequenced here. And now we have Pisolithus, the dog turd fungus, or dead man's foot, or if you want to be not quite so disgusting, you can call it the dyer's puffball, because it is used for fabric and textile dyeing. Used to be called Pisolithus tinctorius, which supposedly is now invalid. There's one called Pisolithus arisis, but I think that's a European species. And when you cut it open, it has these little nuggets, little nodules called peridioles in this gelatinous black matrix. At least at first, it kind of degenerates after that. That's what it looks like after it's broken down a while. There's some of the yarn colors you can get out of it, depending on what mordant you add to it. And there's where it gets the name dead man's foot, as it arises out of the ground and looks like something out of a horror movie. The earth stars, there's at least 3 kinds that we have here. And I'll show those. And then just notice that you've got convergent evolution. This is a geastrum, and it's in order Geastrales rather than Boletales. And so even though it looks very much like the other earth stars, it's a completely different order. Then we have a couple of crust fungi, one called Gyrodontium that has these really weird brain-like corrugations where it grows on logs. And this one's a Sedecula pulvinata, kind of a false truffle. They're not really quite sure where it fits, so they call it Inserte cetus, but it's a relative of the boletes. And I think we're almost done. One more crust fungus, similar but not quite as rugose or corrugated as the Gyrodontium I showed you. And then one that I ought to mention is the Hypomyces chrysospermus, the bolete eater mold. Starts as kind of a white powdery dusting, quickly overtakes the entire surface of the bolete, fills those pores, fills in the reticulations, and the stem starts to swell. It often exceeds the cap diameter. The flesh gets very crumbly and cheesy. It's thought that this is toxic. We're not certain, but best to avoid it. As it progresses, then you just get a completely white coat, and eventually it turns gold, and that's where it gets the name chrysospermus, the sort of golden spores that it produces at its end stage. Okay, if you want to know more about southwestern boletes, we've got some great books that you can look at. I've heard there's supposed to be a southwestern guidebook coming from Noah and Christian. I don't know if that's true. Maybe it's just being talked about, but those guys, the Mushrooms of the Redwood Coast book is one of the nicest guidebooks I've ever seen. And if they do write a southwestern guidebook, it will certainly become the new standard for our area. And then there's iNaturalist and Mushroom Observer. Both have lists, resources that you can check into. If you're looking at the DNA sequences, there's a geotagged mycomap beta that you can go to. Then we've got the Arizona Mushroom Society, about 1,500 members, I think now. We'd love to have you. and then the Arizona Mushroom Forum on Facebook, close to 10,000 members. And it's a pretty lively discussion this time of year and again in the monsoon season. And I think that just about winds it up. I'm sorry that took so long, but I hope it was worth it. There's a lot of boletes here, and I thank you for sticking with me.
That was great, Chris. Thank you. A lot of information there. We have a couple more questions in the chats and the Q&A. So we have one. When you see a gill bolete in the field, what tips you off that you're looking at a bolete and not another family?
Well, they have a very bright yellow gills, and they're decurrent gills. They run down the stem, and that's a fairly distinctive combination. And then, you know, a smooth cap, and the habitat and size and shape and everything is right. But those really bright yellow gills that run down the stem are probably the key for me.
Great. One more from Brandon here in the Q&A, and I'm probably going to pronounce this wrong, but did that Philoporus species stain blue and red?
I don't believe so, no. Did it?
Right.
Did you see some that looked, was there a picture that looked like that?
I definitely saw the blue, that was for sure.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So yeah, if Brandon pops into the chat, we can maybe get some more information on that one.
Yeah. We can go back and look. Let's go. I don't think that combination of colors is a feature, but let's see here. Let's see if I can work us back to Philoporus.
Philoporus.
There it is. Right there.
Maybe it was that red for pink flesh.
Maybe a little bit right there.
Yeah.
Kind of, it gets kind of reddish marks on the stem, but the flesh, you know, is not really staining on the cut specimen. Now, these I'm not familiar with, and it's possible that they do have some red marks there, but I don't know if that's actual bruising or if that's the way God made them. And that one does seem to stain blue, doesn't it? Right there. Is that the one you were talking about, I wonder?
Could be.
Yeah. What is my favorite to find? I'm looking now at the last one in the Q&A. What is your favorite to find? Well, I am a big fan of the porcini, of course, and especially the Boletus rubriceps. So I always try to lay in a pretty good stock of them every summer if I can. Now, as far as what I'd like to find, I'm at the point now where, you know, I have a lot of dried mushrooms, and I don't have to get, you know, I don't have to fill my basket with porcini now. I want to find that Gyroporus cyanescens again, that one that I showed the movie of the blue staining. I feel a little bit responsible for that because I collected that. I dried it and preserved it, and I meant to send it up to David Aurora, and somehow I misplaced it. Well, what I did is I cut it in half, and we ate half and we saved the other half for science, and then we misplaced it. So I'm hoping it turns up in my next move that's coming up in a few months. And if so, I will turn it over to the boletologists for DNA sequencing. But we'd really love to get more of those. So that's the one I'm really looking for.
Great. All right, we have one. We have another one for. If you don't mind answering a couple more, we got some in the chat still.
I'll answer questions for as long as people want to ask them.
All right. Okay, so from Hunter, what makes a butter bolete, and are those just confined to Boletus?
Well, I think they got named butter bolete just because they had those pale yellow stems that are the color of butter, and I think the flesh, you know, the same way. We could ask John Frank and David Aurora. They're both experts in butter boletes, but I don't think it was, you know, I don't think there was any notion that they taste like butter. I think it was the resemblance of the color.
All right.
And if anybody knows differently, feel free to chime in.
Great.
Oh, someone says bug guy. I want to know, right? Bill. Yeah, he was a professional entomologist for his career. He's retired now, but he knows a lot about beetles. And boy, you think there's a lot of boletes, you should go down to the Sky Islands and collect beetles with Bill Warner. Holy moly, there's a lot. He has a museum in his house, in his office, that's just thousands of them. It's really quite spectacular.
All right.
Okay.
Land Mawa is reported to be psychoactive. Is the one in Arizona the same too?
I don't have a clue.
All right.
Sorry, it's only been collected once. We can ask Jonathan Frank.
Mhm.
I don't think that's his bag, but maybe he tried it. Who knows?
Right. All right. One from Dennis Oliver here. Any speculation on why some groups of Boletus and polypores that are genre-rich species few versus genre, like Cortinarius, which is broken up into fewer genre, but is speculating like crazy 600 plus numbers? I'm not 100% sure of the question, but
Amanita is the same way. There are so many Amanitas, but they never get, well, once in a while they do get broken off into something else, a lepidella or whatever. But there's so many Amanitas and so many Cortinarius that never get speciated. I'm not an expert in molecular phylogenetics. I don't know exactly why that is.
All right.
But it has something to do with what the DNA shows, I guess.
Right. Let's see. I think that
because in the past they never would have done it. They kept everything in Boletus or whatever. But anyway, go ahead.
No, I think that was the last question in here. So yeah, I think that's it. That's all the questions in the chat and in the Q&A. So, sorry, we do have one more. Are there any spring boletes?
We don't really have the spring kings like they do, farther west and farther north. I'm trying to think if any of those. I think most of our boletes tend to be, they don't like cold weather. So I am not aware of any boletes that pop up in the spring. Is anyone else on the chat in Arizona at least? No.
I don't see anybody
saying
anything, but yeah, I think that's what I've seen as well. Not really anything in the spring, right?
Yeah, I don't think that's a feature of our sort of phenology, I think is the word for what time of year things pop out based on the climate and conditions.
All right. It looks like that is it. So if there is no more questions, I think that will conclude the webinar today.
There's a new message.
Yep, there is a new message.
What does it say? Oh, I'll volunteer to collect beetles. Okay.
There you go.
Well, come to an AMS meeting and ask for Bill Warner.
Yep, there you go. And then there's any big changes in that way since global warming.
I don't know anything
like
about bugs. I'm sorry.
Yeah. All right.
I assume so, but I couldn't say so for sure.
Yep. Donna's asking, you're not a mycologist?
I am not a mycologist. I'm an enthusiastic amateur. I work as a radiologist.
Great. All right. I think that's it. So at this time, we will conclude the webinar. And thank you for joining, and check out all the NAMA upcoming events and the Arizona Mushroom Society website. We got something very special coming here in the summer with NAMA and AMS. It's going to be culinary focused, and it's Chad Hyatt will be the head chef. Something that you won't want to miss, but check out all that stuff on the NAMA website.
I'm sorry, I tried to keep it to an hour and a half, but there's just too much material.
We have a lot of mushrooms here in Arizona, so
more than people might think.
Right, exactly.
Oh, one more message. Oh, just saying thanks. Thank you for listening.
Yep. Thank you. We'll go ahead and stop the recording and end the webinar. Thank you for joining.
All right.